Hello, it is Friday, the 7th of April 2023. It's Good Friday, which means it's a good time for me to heave the cross that is my increasingly vast number of LaserDiscs up towards the Golgotha, which is my correspondingly large number of YouTube videos. So this is the latest consignment of LaserDiscs that I purchased from Vintage LaserDiscs in South Australia. Once again, I can't quite remember exactly what I paid for, so it's going to be interesting for me to open this box up and take a look at what I've got. I believe there are 14 or 15 titles in here. I'm not going to look at all of them right now, but I'll see if I can get through, most of them at least. Okay, starting off with the good one. This is Matinee, the 1993 comedy film directed by Joe Dante. This is a Japanese LaserDisc. It's a 1994 release from Fuji. So Matinee. I really like this movie. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge fan of Joe Dante, whose other films include Piranha, The Howling, Gremlins 2. So Matinee, it's a very interesting film. It's a film that it didn't do very well upon its release by Universal Pictures back in 1993, but it has got a cult following. And knowing online when there are articles on Joe Dante and discussions, people invariably mention Matinee and quote lines from the movie. It's that sort of film. It's a sort of film where if you feel like you like it, you're kind of in a bit of a secret club of devotees. It's that kind of cult film. Anyway, so it's a really interesting film, Matinee. It's set in 1962. It's actually set in I think it's is it Key West, Florida, and it's sort of got the backdrop is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The main story involves there's a filmmaker, Lawrence Woolsey, played by John Goodman, who's coming by to Florida to premiere his latest movie. And it's like this group of kids that sort of really, really want to see this movie, and there's all these sorts of like hijinks and things. And set against it is the backdrop of the escalating Cold War tensions between America and the Soviet Union. So it's sort of a very interesting blend of like sort of Wonder Years coming of age 60s boomer sort of stuff, and yet you've also got this like zany wacky stuff involving this horror movie and the John Goodman's character, who's based on the famous William Castle, who was always into like bizarre gimmicks to sell his movies, like having skeletons flying across the theater during the film and putting buzzers in seats to sort of tingle people at scary moments. So he's kind of like half film producer, half sort of like carnival barker. So there's a really good cast in this. I mean, there's a bunch of young people who are really good in this, like Simon Fenton, Omri Katz, Kelly Martin, Lisa Jacob. And then you've got John Goodman, of course. You've got Kathy Moriarty, the great Kathy Moriarty, as playing the wife. And then you've got, because it's a Joe Dante movie, you have Dante's repertory stock of amusing actors, guys like Dick Miller, Robert Picardo, Kevin McCarthy. It's just really good. John Sayles has an amusing cameo in this. He worked as a screenwriter on The Howling with Dante, went on to become a great filmmaker, and he has a good performance in this. David Clennon is in this, the great character actor. I always like seeing him. So one thing that's really good about this film is Lawrence Woolsey. He's sort of based on William Castle, although William Castle was more into horror movies, whereas Lawrence Woolsey is producing like sort of 50s style atomic monster movies, which William Castle didn't really do. But anyway, Lawrence Woolsey's movie, Mant, half man, half ant, all terror, you can sort of see there, is like the movie within a movie. So like spliced throughout the film, there's like clips of this movie, Mant, which is about this guy that's sort of bizarrely been infected by ant DNA, and he's like slowly mutating into an ant. It's really funny. The Mant material, it's such a hilarious send up of 50s monster movies. It's very funny. And there are some DVD, Blu-ray editions of Matinee that actually have all the Mant material that's in the movie all spliced together to sort of form its own. I think it's like 15 or 20 minutes long, but it's really good. But the movie surrounding it is good as well. This is probably my second favorite Joe Dante film. My first is probably Gremlins 2, the new batch from 1990. But Matinee comes right after that. It's a very sweet, very funny, very affectionate movie, especially if you're into like old school monster movies and things. It's a really wonderful movie. Probably deserves to be better known than it actually is. But those who have seen it sort of know what a good movie it is. Another great film. This is The Apartment, the great Billy Wilder film, The Apartment from 1960. This is a Japanese laserdisc from MGMUA from 1996. Right, so The Apartment, directed by the great Billy Wilder, starring Jack Lemmon, Shirley MacLaine, and Fred MacMurray. So Billy Wilder, I'm a huge fan of Billy Wilder. He was maybe the best director working in Hollywood during the old studio period. So he's probably best known for his comedies, films like The 7-Year Itch, Sabrina, Some Like It Hot. I do like those movies, but I'm actually a much bigger fan of the more serious films that Billy Wilder directed, like The Lost Weekend, Double Indemnity, Ace in the Hole, Stalag 17, and I really do like The Apartment, which is. It is a comedy, but it's not. It's sort of different from Wilder's other comedies. So it stars Jack Lemmon as Bud Baxter, who's a sort of a kind of a meek office worker, and the gimmick is that he's sort of taken advantage of by his superiors, who kind of use his apartment for their philandering activities, and he sort of like goes with it, and then. Shirley MacLaine plays the elevator girl, Fran Kubelik, that Jack Lemmon falls in love with. So it's kind of it's a romantic comedy, but it has a very palpable strain of like melancholy through it. It's not it's actually, I mean, I don't want to say dramedy, but it's not really like a laugh out loud comedy, although it does have some very funny moments in this. Great cast as well: Fred MacMurray, Ray Walston, Edie Adams. It was written by Billy Wilder and I.A.L. Diamond, who collaborated with Wilder on some other films. Actually, now that I think about it, talking about Billy Wilder's comedies, he directed a comedy in the 1960s, 1, 2, 3, a sort of a Cold War comedy with James Cagney, which I really like. That's actually one of my favorite Billy Wilder films. So yeah, we can see this is a nice gatefold, like images from this. Much as I love this film, and I do love this film, at the Academy Awards it won Best Picture, and that was the year that Psycho was released. And I think in hindsight, Psycho was the better film, but these things happen. So Billy Wilder actually directed Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine in another movie just after this, Irma la Douce, which is a comedy, and it's actually, to be honest, it's not a very good movie. It's certainly nowhere near as good as this movie. This is a really good movie. It's a very well written, very well acted, in many ways unconventional romantic comedy with some emotional heft to it. It's a great film. Here's something interesting. The Obi strip on this Laserdisc of The Apartment has this little message. Thank you, 15th anniversary Laserdisc. So this is from 1996. So that would put the 15th anniversary at 1981. So that must have been the year that Laserdisc was made commercially available to consumers. Miller's Crossing, the great mob gangster movie, written, produced, and directed by the Coen brothers, Joel Coen and Ethan Coen. This is a terrific film. The film from 1990. This is a 1991 Japanese laserdisc from Fox Video. I'm a big fan of the Coen brothers. I would, with great difficulty, I could name my favorite 5, and this is definitely one of them. So this is a really, really terrific film with a great cast. You've got Gabriel Byrne, you've got Albert Finney, who's absolutely terrific in this, Marcia Gay Harden, John Turturro, John Polito, J.E. Freeman. It's just really good. Great music by the Coen's frequent collaborator, Carter Burwell, cinematography by Barry Sonnenfeld. There are so many great moments in this film. We can see here the image used for the sleeve here is the famous scene where Gabriel Byrne's character drags John Turturro's character into the woods to execute him, and John Turturro's pleading for his life. That's a great moment. My favorite part in the film is the famous sequence of Albert Finney's character being the victim of an attempted assassination, and he gets out of bed and gets a Tommy gun and sort of chases out and defeats his would-be assailants, all set to the strains of Danny Boy by Irish tenor Frank Patterson. That's such a great moment. I remember the last time I watched this movie, I watched it with a bunch of friends, and it was very, it was kind of influential in a sense that we were like peppering our dialogue in our conversations for a while after with the stylized dialogue from this movie. Like, I think we kept referring to the hi-hat for quite a while after we saw this movie. Yeah, one of the amusing / infuriating things attached to this movie is that it and Goodfellas were both nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, and they were both beaten by Dances with Wolves, which is kind of it's pretty galling, but what else can you expect from the Academy, huh? Okay, Psycho 2. This was a movie released by Universal Pictures in 1983. This is a CIC LaserDisc, a Japanese LaserDisc from 1986. Okay, Psycho 2. I'm a really, really big fan of this movie. So the original Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, was released in 1960. The sequel was made 22 years later, released 23 years later. And it was actually a surprise box office hit. And it got some good reviews. Like, there was probably very little expectation that this would be a good movie, a belated sequel to a classic film directed by a revered filmmaker, but somehow against the odds, this film did it. So it was directed by Richard Franklin, an Australian filmmaker he's got some really, really good credits. Richard Franklin, he directed movies like Patrick, Road Games, Cloak and Dagger. Really, really good director. So what happened was, I think for years, I think Universal probably wanted to make a Psycho sequel for a number of years, and for whatever reason, it just never got off the ground. I think originally Psycho 2 began as like a TV movie sort of deal, probably in the vein of, there was like crappy TV movie sequels to, like, there was one for Rosemary's Baby, which was no good. But anyway, I think once Anthony Perkins agreed to reprise the role of Norman Bates, his iconic star-making role, which I think he'd been sort of avoiding for years, probably for fear of being typecast. Once Anthony Perkins was agreed to be involved, that sort of made Universal bump it up to think, okay, well, this is probably going to be, we're going to put a bit more money into this. This could actually be, a theatrical feature. The movie was written by Tom Holland, who, as a screenwriter, he wrote Class of 1984. He collaborated with Richard Franklin again on Cloak and Dagger, which is a really good movie. And then later on, his first movie as writer-director was Fright Night. Then he co-wrote and directed the original Child's Play. So he's a really good screenwriter-director with lots of good credits. Anyway, so this picks up. The novel of Psycho was written by Robert Bloch, who actually wrote a sequel novel, Psycho 2, but Universal didn't base their movie Psycho 2 on the novel Psycho 2. So the novel Psycho 2 has pretty much nothing to do with this movie. So anyway, this picks up 22 years later when Norman Bates is freed after, a couple of decades of being institutionalized. And he goes back to the Bates Motel, and he's sort of trying to, put his past bouts of insanity and murder and stuff behind him. What happens is there's a contingent of sort of townsfolk that sort of not happy that Norman's been released, and they're sort of doing their bit to I guess undermine his sense of reality and sort of push it, force his hand and make him do things that will get him locked up again. So what's really interesting, so obviously in the original Psycho, for people unfamiliar with the film at the time, Norman Bates is sort of presented as something of a protagonist, and it's like a shock when it's revealed that he's got a disassociated personality, and like he's been committing murders and stuff. But with Psycho 2, obviously people know from the outset what Norman is, but the movie doesn't make him a villain. Like, he's still very much the sympathetic protagonist of this movie, and it's like you get the feeling that if people just left him alone, he would be okay. But it's like these people that are just basically doing their thing to basically torment and persecute him and sort of make him go crazy. So you're on Norman's side the whole time, and of course, as the movie goes, it's only a matter of time before he snaps. But Yeah, so it's got a really good cast. Like Anthony Perkins is really good in this. Great actor. And he does a really good job of playing Norman Bates. A couple of decades after his original portrayal. You've got Meg Tilly in this as a girl who befriends Norman, and she sort of figures quite prominently into the plot twists and stuff that happen. You've got Robert Loggia, the great Robert Loggia, is in this as a sympathetic psychiatrist. Dennis Franz is in this. He plays like a sleazy motel owner. He's really, really good. He's a really horrible character in this. And Vera Miles, who played Janet Leigh's sister in the original Psycho, she's in this. She's the only other person in this apart from Anthony Perkins to reprise their role from the original movie. This is a really good film. My only gripe is it has a bit of a tacky cliffhanger ending, which sort of I'm not really a fan of, but then it gets kind of resolved in Psycho 3, which was released in 1986 and which Anthony Perkins directed. And then there was Psycho 4 in 1991 or 1990. But this is the best. This is the best of the Psycho sequels. It's a really good film. And interestingly, Quentin Tarantino, when he's not really much of a Hitchcock fan, and when he was asked about Psycho, he sort of admitted he didn't really like Psycho, but he really liked Psycho 2. He sort of went on a bit of a rant about Psycho 2, how good Psycho 2 is, which is interesting. Oh, the Blob. Okay, this is the 1988 remake of the Blob. This is a 1989 Japanese laserdisc from RCA Columbia. So in the beginning in the late 1970s and all throughout the 80s, there was sort of a trend of like big budget, more explicitly gory remakes of sort of old genre films. So you had in 1978 there was the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In 1982 there was a remake of The Thing. In 1983 there was a remake of Cat People. In 1986 there was the remake of The Fly, and there were probably some others. And anyway, so in 1988 they did a remake of The Blob. So the original movie The Blob was from 1958, starring Steve McQueen, and it had a title song by Burt Bacharach, and it's a really, really, really campy movie. This film is much more serious-minded, or as serious-minded as a film about a gelatinous alien organism taking over a town can be. But it's a really, really gory film. It was directed by Chuck Russell and co-written by Frank Darabont. The two of them had collaborated the previous year on A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. Chuck Russell, incidentally, went on to direct the Jim Carrey movie The Mask, and Frank Darabont went on to direct movies like The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. So this really just takes the the bare bones plot of the original film and then sort of does its own thing. So you've got this disgusting blobby organism that lands in a town, and it's like murderous and like just wiping out people. So this is really good. It's got an interesting cast. Kevin Dillon is in this as sort of the sort of bad boy biker guy, and Shawnee Smith is the female lead. This film's quite interesting because it sort of doesn't really delve away from having children getting killed. It's really quite bloody. It's a movie that I remember when I was a kid, I used to always be fascinated by the VHS cassette in the video store, especially this bit with the guy with the blob sort of coming out of the sink and like grabbing him by the head. I think in the movie, it pulls the guy sort of into the plug hole and just basically like shreds this guy, pulling his body into the sink. So this is a good. It's a good film. I mean, it's one of those movies that it's not a raging masterpiece, but if you want to get together with some friends and sort of just watch like a gory amusing 80s horror movie, this is a really good one to pick. Nosferatu the Vampire, the 1979 film written and directed by Werner Herzog. This is a great film. This is one of the best vampire movies. So this is a Japanese laserdisc from CBS Fox from 1987, I believe. Yes, 1987. So the movie's from 1979. So the original Nosferatu was directed by F.W. Murnau and was released in 1922. It was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it was like a seminal, influential, still kind of creepy vampire movie, and it was regarded as one of the great films of the silent era, one of the best German films of that time. And Werner Herzog was a great fan of the film, and he wanted to remake it, which he did. So although this is this is a remake of Nosferatu, and it's very similar to the previous film. Although because I think by this time Dracula had lapsed into the public domain, so unlike Murnau, Werner Herzog was free to sort of use the character names from the original novel. So you've got Klaus Kinski in one of, I think it was 5 films that he made with Herzog. There was Aguirre, The Wrath of God, Wojciech, Nosferatu, Fitzcarraldo, and Cobra Verde. So, Klaus Kinski plays Dracula in this. You've got Isabella Gianni playing Lucy, who is basically Mina from the novel, but they switched the names of Lisa. They switched the names of Mina and Lucy in this, and Bruno Ganz as Jonathan Harker. So it was interesting. So you've got Roland Topper, the great. He's a writer. He's in this. He plays Renfield. He's kind of like a creepy, giggling performance. So this was filmed actually simultaneously in German and in English. So there are 2 versions of this. I think there were like Blu-rays and DVDs that include both versions of it. I think the German language version is probably better. But anyway, if you're familiar with the story of Dracula, this is pretty much it. Although it's massively streamlined and simplified. There's a lot of supporting characters who aren't in this, and there's like composite characters. And interestingly, the character of Professor Van Helsing, who's the sort of vampirologist in other versions of the film, in this he's kind of like a cynical, doddering old guy that doesn't really believe in vampires, and he's kind of it's quite a different portrayal. But this is magnificently filmed. It's great. Location shooting with castles and villages and mountains and everything. It just looks absolutely fantastic. Certainly better than anything that they would do today with CGI. It just looks so authentic and real. There's a motif of like plague and rats in this. Klaus Kinski is really good as a sort of a creepy and kind of sympathetic vampire. He kind of is like lonely and sort of yearns for the release of death. Isabella Gianni is fantastic. She's absolutely luminous in this film. Really, really gorgeous in a sort of a fairy tale sort of way. Bruno Ganz is really good. The music by Popol Vuh is really fantastic. A lot of like period music, a lot of haunting music. There's all just really, really great creepy touches, like the opening sequence in the catacombs, and it's just I can't really speak highly enough of this movie. I'm really just blabbering it at this point, but this is a fantastic film. I am a huge fan of the films of Werner Herzog, his fiction and his fiction films and his documentary films, and Nosferatu is one of my favorite Herzog films. It's still very unique. It just has a very eerie elegance to it that you don't get in many other Dracula films, certainly not in many other vampire films. Nosferatu was actually released, I believe, the same year as another big screen adaptation of the Dracula story, and that was the film that was just called Dracula, the one that was an adaptation of the stage play. That's the one that has Frank Langella as Dracula and Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing. It's okay. I don't mind it. I don't think it's especially great. It's certainly not as good as Nosferatu. I am aware that there is ample evidence that Klaus Kinski was an appalling human being, but that said, I can't deny that he was in some really, really good films, and he delivered really fantastic performances in them, very effective performances. He made a lot of crap as well, particularly in the 1980s, but he does a really good job in the role of Dracula in Nosferatu, especially considering he's recreating a role, essentially Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck in the Murnau film from 1922, which is a very famous, iconic, indelible interpretation with the sort of the hideous bat-like makeup, the clawed hands and the teeth and everything, but he looks very close to Schreck's performance in this, and he delivers a fascinatingly multifaceted interpretation of a hideous monster. I've already talked about Isabella Gianni in my when I looked at Truffaut's The Story of Adele H. She's really good in this film as well. There's an absolutely fantastic scene probably my favorite scene in the film. It doesn't even have Dracula in it. It's when the town of Bremen is overtaken by the plague that Dracula's diseased rats have brought, to the town, and Lucy, played by Isabella Gianni, is wandering through the town where everyone's dying, and she goes into the town square, and all the people there are having a big feast, and they're sort of celebrating, going out with a bang. They all know that they're dying, and they're determined to just sort of have like a big party before they all die, and they're sitting around this table with food and drink, and there's all rats all over the place, like scurrying over the table and all around the place, and these people are just like have gone insane, and Lucy is like the one sane person left in the town, and she takes it upon herself to defeat Dracula. It's a really great scene. There was actually a quasi-sequel to this movie. Werner Herzog didn't have anything to do with it. It was released, I think it was 1987 or 1998, and it's known by various names, but I think the most common one is Nosferatu in Venice. Klaus Kinski was in it, although he was Dracula in Nosferatu the Vampire. In Nosferatu in Venice, he's actually called Nosferatu, and he doesn't have the same makeup. Like, I think Kinski couldn't be bothered, or having the extensive makeup applied, so he really just he has his long hair, and he just, instead of being bald, and he just looks like Klaus Kinski. It's an interesting film. It's got Donald Pleasance and Christopher Plummer in it. It's an interesting film. It's kind of amusing. It's not great, but it's certainly nowhere near as good as this. But it's kind of worth watching. There was a recent Blu-ray release of the film. Okay, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the 1931 horror film. This is a 1994 Japanese laserdisc from an organization called Classic Film Collection. Okay, right, so the original novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, by Robert Louis Stevenson, is from 1886. There's been innumerable screen adaptations of the story. This was one of the most influential. So Frederick March plays the mild-mannered Victorian-era scientist who, devises and consumes a potion that turns him into a homicidal maniac. So what's interesting is that everyone knows what Jekyll and Hyde, what the story is, although the original novella is basically a mystery. It's not really until later on in the story, and it's a plot twist that, Jekyll and Hyde are actually the same person. Of course, most movies, there's no mystery of which to speak. Everyone knows from the beginning the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde. So this film was quite interesting. It was sort of released in the same era as the sort of classic Universal era of horror films, where Universal was adapting things like Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, The Wolfman. This wasn't made by Universal. This was made by Paramount Pictures, directed by Robert Mamoulian. Miriam Hopkins is in this. Like most versions of the story that are rendered for the screen, it sort of strays quite significantly from the original novella and sort of does its own thing. So in this one, you can sort of see the makeup for the character when he transforms into Mr. Hyde. He's like sort of much more like feral and simian, and hairy, with like the sort of the massive teeth and everything. Which has kind of influenced the popular perception of Mr. Hyde. But yeah, this is a good film, especially like if you're into like classic horror movies of that era of the 1930s, 1940s, etc. It's a lot better than the 1941 version that came by, that had Spencer Tracy and Ingrid Bergman in it. This is a much better film, pre-code as well. So it's kind of, it was pushing the boundaries for what film could do back then. So there have been many screen versions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde over the years. My favorite version of all the ones I've seen is a version that was relatively obscure for a number of years, but in more recent years, it's become better known and more appreciated, and that's the 1981 European version, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Miss Osborne, written and directed by Valerian Borovchik and starring Udo Kier and Marina Pietro. That's a really good film. It's my favorite of all the Jekyll and Hydes. But this version's pretty good too. Frankenstein, the classic horror film from Universal from 1931. This is a Japanese laserdisc from Universal Home Video from 1993. So Frankenstein. This is Mary Shelley wrote the novel Frankenstein in 1818, and it was revised in 1831. Groundbreaking, classic, influential science fiction horror novel. I suspect when people think of Frankenstein, they're probably more familiar with the many film versions rather than the original book. The book is great, by the way, and this wasn't the first adaptation of the story, but it was kind of the first big one. So Universal sort of staked a claim in the 1930s for their horror film adaptations. Horror story adaptations, rather. They did The Phantom of the Opera in 1925. They did Dracula in 1930, Frankenstein. Then after that came The Invisible Man, The Wolfman, etc. The Mummy. All great. Many great films there. So Universal had a big hit in 1930 with Dracula. Directed by Todd Browning and starring Bela Lugosi. And then in 1931, the year after, they made Frankenstein. So this was directed by James Whale, the great British filmmaker, and it stars Colin Clive as Frankenstein the scientist and Boris Karloff as the monster he creates. So two great British actors. This was a very successful movie. I mean, with the iconic makeup effects for the Frankenstein monster designed by Jack Pierce, which has become pretty much the most popular accepted version of visual version of the Frankenstein monster. So the film, it adapts like basically the first half of Mary Shelley's novel in a very simplified, streamlined way without losing the core themes of the story. And the monster, who's quite articulate and intelligent in the book, becomes sort of more, or he's silent in this film at least, sort of much more. His intelligence is greatly reduced, but yeah. So this film, 1931's Frankenstein, adapts the first half of the novel. The second half of the novel, which is all to do with the monster pressing Frankenstein to create a female companion, that was adapted into the sequel to this film, 1935's Bride of Frankenstein, which is a brilliant movie too. The trend amongst cinephiles and film buffs is to rate Bride of Frankenstein as better than the 1931 Frankenstein. I actually prefer this version, although there are many great things about Bride of Frankenstein. It's got more humor, it's got more music. Karloff has more to do as the monster. There's sort of more dimensions to the creature. So I can totally understand why many people prefer Bride of Frankenstein, but I kind of prefer the sort of more dour, somber film, which is the original 1931. Yeah. So James Whale, he directed Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. He didn't direct Son of Frankenstein from 1939. That's the third and last time that Karloff played the creature, and that was directed by Roland V. Lee. It's a pretty good movie. It's not as good as the two James Whale ones. So James Whale, he directed Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, and he directed The Invisible Man, and they are, for my money, they're the three best of the Universal classic horror films of that era. Like there's those three movies, and then I feel there's kind of a significant drop in quality before you get to all the other ones. But so this is definitely one of the best, classic, black and white, creaky, creepy movie, but with some depth and with some heart and some great performances. Colin Clive is really good as Frankenstein. He unfortunately he was, I think he was an alcoholic. He died relatively young, but he's good in this, and he's good in Bride of Frankenstein, as is Boris Karloff. I have very fond memories of the James Whale Frankenstein films. I remember seeing them for the first time. Must have been mid to late 1990s. Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein showed up a lot on one of the movie channels, and I watched it. I watched them both, and I really liked both of them. I especially like the performance of Elsa Lanchester in Bride of Frankenstein, but I will talk more about that if and when I get a copy of Bride of Frankenstein on LaserDisc. Oh, isn't that pretty? Okay, so this is the 1957 Hammer horror film, The Curse of Frankenstein. This is a 1993 Japanese laserdisc from Warner Home Video. Okay, so The Curse of Frankenstein, it's really good. I mean, obviously there are many film and screen adaptations of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Some good ones, a lot of not so good ones. This is one of the better ones, although of course it takes massive liberties with the original story, as most Frankenstein adaptations do. It does streamline the story somewhat, but anyway. This came out in 1957, and it was this was one of the films that sort of really helped jumpstart the whole Hammer horror phenomenon, which was a series of widely diverse horror films made by the British film studio Hammer, all throughout from the late 50s all throughout to the 1970s. Yeah, so this is really good. This version stars Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein and Christopher Lee as the monster. Yeah, so I think Frankenstein, he's much more villainous in this than in other adaptations. Certainly, he's far less sympathetic than the Colin Clive version from the old James Whale Frankenstein films from the 1930s. Yeah, this is a really good film. There was a concerted effort to sort of differentiate this from the classic Universal Frankenstein films. So I think Universal had the copyright on the makeup that Boris Karloff and his successors wore. So they don't really try to make the creature in this resemble the old Karloff monster. He looks much more grotesque, much more like a patched together, like, victim of, he looks like a hideous accident victim in this. He's quite horrific looking. So there was actually a whole series of Frankenstein movies that Hammer made following this. What's interesting is that how different it is to the Universal Frankenstein series of films, because with Universal, the constant in the films was the monster. So the actual character of Frankenstein himself was only in the first couple of movies, and then there was a whole series of movies where it was basically the adventures and misadventures of the monster. What Hammer did, which was quite different, is that the character of Frankenstein himself, the scientist, he's the constant in the series. So the original monster is actually only in this one movie, and then there's a whole series of Hammer Frankenstein movies where it's all about Frankenstein, played by Peter Cushing, like his his subsequent experiments and like the other creatures that he creates. So it's kind of interesting. I'm a big fan of the Hammer Frankenstein films. There's a couple of duds, but they're mostly pretty good and pretty interesting. Including I think it was it Frankenstein Created Woman? That's a really good one. Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, that was another good one. Frankenstein Created Woman, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, and the original Curse of Frankenstein. Those were the three best of the Hammer Frankenstein films, I think. Another obvious point of differentiation between the Universal Frankenstein movies and the Hammer ones is that the Hammer ones were in color, so they were they're much more sort of lush looking, with great production design, costumes, all very they're more overtly sexual than the Universal films. Obviously, they could get away with more a few decades later. The original Universal films were all black and white and were pretty good. Like the first two James Whale Frankenstein films were probably the best Frankenstein movies ever made. But I find that most of the subsequent Frankenstein movies made by Universal are sort of middling to okay. But I think as a series, the Hammer Frankenstein films hold up a lot better, looking at the series as a whole. Okay, this is Dracula, aka Horror of Dracula, from 1958. This is the film that was made by Hammer Film Productions. It was directed by Terence Fisher and written by Jimmy Sangster, based on the novel by Bram Stoker. Yeah, so 1957, Terence Fisher and Jimmy Sangster directed and wrote Curse of Frankenstein for Hammer, and then the following year, 1958, they adapted Dracula. So it was released as Dracula in the UK, where it was made, and it was released in the US as Horror of Dracula, I guess to differentiate it from the 1930 Universal Dracula film. So this is a pretty good film. It stars the sort of classic pairing of Christopher Lee as Dracula and Peter Cushing as Professor Van Helsing. So Cushing and Lee both appeared in Curse of Frankenstein, with Cushing as Frankenstein and Christopher Lee as the monster. So yeah, this is a pretty good film. I mean, like most Dracula adaptations, it kind of condenses the story and sort of eliminates a lot of characters and sort of combines other characters. So it's not the best Dracula adaptation, but it's pretty good. It's very vividly filmed. The production design, the costumes, great acting. Michael Gough is in this. He plays Jonathan Harker, and I think, I was never really a huge fan of Bela Lugosi's Dracula from the Universal films. Like Christopher Lee is like one of the. He's probably the definitive on-screen Dracula. He sort of made Dracula much more less campy, but sort of, he still had that sort of aristocratic, suave, much more sort of overtly sexual, I feel, quality to the creature of Dracula. Like Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula led to a whole series of Dracula films, most of which starred Christopher Lee. They're pretty good, the series. There's some good ones. I mean, it did get pretty campy towards the end in the 1970s, but I think on the whole, I think the Hammer Frankenstein films are better than the Dracula ones. But both series have their good and not so good installments. Yeah, this is a good film. I do have all of the Hammer, Frankenstein, and Dracula films on Blu-ray. It was a little bit of a pain amassing all of them because they weren't all distributed by the same company. So, like, it was some of them were available from here, some of them weren't available from here, and there's no comprehensive box set of all of the Frankensteins and all of the Draculas from Hammer. You have to sort of just get them all from different companies. That's all for now. Catch you later, meatheads.